Welcome, everyone, to a deep dive into a really disturbing case, the murder of Ryan Poston by Shayna Hubers. We're going to be going through court documents, interviews, news reports, all kinds of things to try and understand how this happened.
It's a case that has fascinated a lot of people, and we're trying to see how a relationship that was on again, off again could end in such a tragedy.
Yeah, and I guess the big question the whole way through is, was this self-defense, as Shayna claimed, or was it something far more sinister?
Well, and the story starts on October 12,
Yeah.
2012. Shayna calls 911, confesses to shooting Ryan.
Right.
But even in this initial call, there are these details that raise red flags.
Yeah, it's so interesting hearing that call and hearing her describe shooting him multiple times.
Right.
There's this really disturbing contrast, between the gravity of what she's done and the way she's talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very casual.
Casual.
Yeah. And she tells the operator she continued shooting because he was twitching and she wanted to make sure he was dead. And then later she adds this chilling detail about giving Ryan the nose job he always wanted.
Yeah.
These statements, along with the forensic evidence, paint a very different picture from, a classic self-defense scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get into that forensic evidence. What did the investigators find?
Well, one of the most important things is the trajectory of the bullets.
Okay.
The downward angle of the first shot and then the close proximity of the subsequent shots and the blood spatter patterns, they all contradict Shayna's initial claim that she was, in fear for her life. And then there's the fact that the gun's safety was off.
Right.
Which suggests a level of preparation that doesn't really fit with a spontaneous act of self-defense.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I hadn't really thought about that before. But before we go too far into, analyzing her actions, I think it's important to understand, who Ryan Poston was.
Absolutely.
Outside of this tragedy. His loved ones paint a picture of a man who was so dedicated to his community.
Yeah, he was a really successful attorney, and he often took on cases pro bono.
Wow.
He had this really strong sense of justice and compassion. He would go above and beyond for his clients, even people who couldn't afford to pay him.
It's amazing. And outside of his professional life, he was so close with his family, especially his father and his younger sisters.
Yeah, they were very close.
Yeah. This picture of Ryan that they paint really stands in contrast to the image that Shayna tries to create later.
Yes.
She tries to paint him as an abusive and controlling partner.
Right, and that brings us to their relationship. I think it's really important to understand the dynamics that ultimately led to this tragic event.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, their relationship, it was intense and volatile, always this push and pull, but there's a clear pattern of obsessive behavior from Shayna.
Right, like the constant texts and calls.
Yeah, hundreds of messages from her, for everyone, from Ryan.
Wow, and there's stories of her showing up at his condo, unannounced. Just this need to control where he was and who he was with.
Yeah, and we even have Ryan telling his friends, that he was afraid and frustrated by her behavior.
Really?
He called her crazy, said things were escalating to restraining order level crazy.
Wow. But there's also this interesting observation from a neighbor.
Okay.
They saw Shayna with bruises, but also doting on Ryan, almost taking care of him.
Interesting.
It suggests maybe there was a more complex dynamic than we initially thought.
Yeah, it does make you wonder, was this just unrequited love and obsession?
Yeah.
Or was there a darker side to the relationship, maybe with abuse from both sides?
That's a great question, and I think it's one we'll need to revisit as we go further into the case.
Absolutely. There are so many layers here that need to be looked at really carefully.
Before we move on to, the lead up to the shooting,
Yeah.
I think there's one question we should address.
Okay.
Could Ryan have, unintentionally contributed to Shayna's obsession?
Right.
Did he send mixed signals even though he wanted out?
Well, it's definitely possible. We know that Shayna texted a friend and admitted that she knew Ryan stayed with her out of guilt. So it seems like he might have struggled with setting those firm boundaries.
Yeah.
Maybe he was afraid of her reaction.
That makes sense.
Maybe he just couldn't bring himself to fully break away, and that could have given Shayna false hope.
Right.
And then when that hope was gone, that might have triggered her rage.
And that leads us to the question of motive and premeditation.
Right.
Was this a crime of passion or something more calculated?
Well, there's a few pieces of evidence that suggest premeditation.
Okay.
One really chilling detail comes from a story about an incident at a shooting range. Shayna apparently told a friend that she had fantasized about killing Ryan.
Oh, wow.
And making it look like an accident.
That's disturbing. It really sounds like she was thinking about this beforehand.
Yeah, and then there's another detail that's important. Shayna's internet search history in the hours before the shooting. She was looking up Ms. Ohio 2012 Audrey Bolt.
The woman that Ryan was going to go on a date with that night.
Exactly. And the prosecution argued that this, along with everything else we've talked about, the forensic evidence, her statements painted a very clear picture that Shayna couldn't stand the thought of Ryan being with someone else.
Right.
This wasn't self-defense. This was a planned murder driven by jealousy and the need to control Ryan.
Okay, so let's move on to the trials.
Yeah.
Shayna actually had 2 trials, and they both really captured the public's attention. What were the main arguments that each side used?
Well, in the first trial, the defense really focused on the self-defense claim. They tried to portray Shayna as a victim of abuse who was acting out of fear.
Right.
They had witnesses who talked about Ryan's supposed controlling behavior and how emotionally fragile Shayna was.
But the prosecution countered that pretty effectively.
Yeah, they presented all that forensic evidence pointing out that it didn't match up with Shayna's story.
Right.
They talked about the bullet trajectory, the fact that Shayna didn't have any defensive wounds, and the gun's safety being off all signs of premeditation.
And the jury agreed with the prosecution. She was found guilty of murder.
She was, but the verdict was actually overturned because of a technicality.
What happened?
One of the jurors had a felony conviction, which meant he wasn't supposed to be on the jury.
Oh, wow.
So they had to have a new trial.
Okay, so what happened in the second trial?
Well, that's where the defense changed their strategy.
How so?
They introduced this idea of extreme emotional disturbance. They were basically arguing that Shayna's mental state and the abuse she claimed she suffered meant she wasn't in control when she shot Ryan.
Okay.
They brought in a psychologist who diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder, narcissism, and PTSD.
So they were saying that even though she killed him, she wasn't totally responsible because of her mental state.
Right. They tried to paint this picture of a woman who had been pushed to her breaking point and acted impulsively.
Interesting.
Shayna even testified herself, gave this very emotional testimony about the abuse she said Ryan had inflicted on her.
Wow.
But the prosecution argued that this was all an act. They said she was trying to manipulate the jury and pointed to all the evidence of premeditation. The internet searches her calmness after the shooting.
Right.
They said that even if she did have personality disorders, that didn't excuse what she did. They said her actions showed she was vengeful and calculated, not someone who was just overwhelmed by emotion.
And what did the jury decide?
Well, they sided with the prosecution again.
Okay.
Shayna was found guilty of murder again and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years.
Wow. So despite being convicted and all the evidence against her, Shayna still says she's innocent.
That's right. She even tried to get a third trial.
Really?
Yeah, but it was denied. It's almost like she's created this alternate reality where she's the victim.
It's really hard to understand how someone could do something so violent and then so completely deny any responsibility.
And that's what makes this case so unsettling, especially with her parole hearing coming up in 2032.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, can someone like that ever really change? Yeah, it's a scary thought, her getting out of prison, going back into the world while everyone else has moved on and she's still stuck in this version of events.
Yeah, and it's a reminder of how much this tragedy has affected people.
Yeah.
It goes way beyond the courtroom. It's really impacted the lives of everyone who knew and loved Ryan Poston.
His father, Jay Poston, has talked about how much he misses Ryan. All the things he's missed out on, all the milestones, the future that was stolen. It's just heartbreaking to hear him talk about it.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that Ryan was more than just, a victim in this case. He was a son, a brother, a friend, a talented lawyer who wanted to help people. His story shows us that behind all the headlines and the legal battles, there are real people whose lives are shattered by this kind of violence.
As we come to the end of this deep dive, I'm left with this feeling of unease, like something's not settled.
Yeah, I think that's what happens when you really dig into a case like this. We can try to put the pieces together, understand the motives, analyze everything, but we can never really understand the darkness that drives someone to take a life.
So what can we learn from this story? What are the takeaways from this whole thing with love and obsession and violence?
Well, I think it makes us think about the warning signs of toxic relationships. Those red flags we often ignore. It reminds us to listen to people when they tell us they're scared to believe them and support them.
And it makes us question our own ideas about justice and accountability. Can someone really be rehabilitated if they don't feel sorry for what they did? What does a just outcome even mean in a case like this?
Those are really tough questions, and there are no easy answers. I think we'll keep debating those questions as Shayna's parole hearing gets closer. In the end, it's up to each of us to wrestle with these complicated issues, to look at the information and decide what we believe.
This deep dive has taken us to some really dark places, It's a reminder of how fragile life is and what can happen when obsession takes over. Thank you for joining us for this exploration into this tragic case. We encourage you to keep learning about it, read the court documents, listen to the interviews, and really think about the difficult truths that this case reveals. Maybe most importantly, we hope this encourages you to be more aware, more empathetic, and more understanding in your own lives and communities. Thank you for listening.